Hey everyone, Nathan from Black Belt MTG back here, and today I'm going to be looking at 3 Domain Zoo decks that did well at recent events. These are all ones that happened over the past week or so, kind of larger tournaments. Starting off with a list from LastClaw. This list actually finished 8th in this weekend, one of this weekend's Modern Challenges. The player who goes by LastClaw on MTGO is actually in the Domain Zoo Discord, so I got some insight onto some of his card choices. He did finish 8th and didn't want to play 3 more rounds, so he just basically dropped after making the top 8, so there's potential he could have gone further. Looking at his list here, he's got some choices that we haven't seen a lot in Domain Zoo, although it's starting to come out with the recent unbanning of Preordained. So to start off, he's running 3 Preordained. I have seen some lists running 4. I think Preordained is a very actually good fit for Zoo. At first I was skeptical because this is an aggressive deck and generally cantrips are not that good in an aggressive deck. We've seen Expressive Iteration played before with some success, but I haven't liked it a lot when I've tested it. It can be a little clunky in a deck with so many 2-drops. Preordained is different though, and Preordained allows you to do a few things. One, it's 1 mana, and that's very important for a deck that's built around so many impactful 2-drops and some impactful 1-drops as well. So it can be very easy to play Preordain on turn 3, dig to find a threat or interaction or whatever you need, and then play that the same turn. That's a lot more impactful than going, if you had an Expressive Iteration on turn 3, maybe now you have to hope that you hit a land and that you hit like a 1-mana spell that's impactful in order to do anything that turn. Also, Preordain can be used to dig for lands, I think, a little more easily because it costs 1 mana. So you could maybe on turn 2, you want to play a 1-drop and then Preordain or something like that, where you Preordain, find a land. And also, it's very good late game. So what I found a lot is, obviously, if you top deck Preordain, it's a very strong top deck because you can dig even deeper for what you need. But I think the most common use case for this is to dig for either another big creature in a deck, in a game where maybe all your creatures have been killed from removal and stuff. Now Preordain, like I said, on turn 3, if you have 3 lands, you can now dig for another Kavu, another Scion, something like that. Or in a matchup where you're kind of in a stalemate or you need to disrupt the opponent, now you need to try to find something like a Leyline Binding. Very useful there. And then lastly, the most common use case that came up when I did a little testing with Preordain, I plan on playing some more with it, is usually you will dig for lethal burn damage. So you can dig for Tribal Flames to finish the game out. You can also dig for Lightning Bolt to finish the game out that way. That happens very common. Originally, I thought Preordain wouldn't really work in this deck, but in my testing and some other players have tested it, and it actually works really well. Looking at the list here, he's got pretty much 3 Preordain. The rest of the list is mostly stock from what we've seen. He does have 1 Tarfire, and that's because he's running Tarmogoyf over Nishoba Brawler as a 4 of. I think Tarmogoyf does definitely get better with Preordain because that's just another sorcery now to fill your graveyard. So there's also an argument to Tarmogoyf might just be the better choice now over Brawler. I have to do more testing with it. And he's the other difference he has here is he's running 20 lands. So we were able to trim 1 land because we're running these 3 Preordains. And he has no Overgrown Tomb, so he has no Shock Black Source. So his only black sources are going to be on Zagoth and Savai, because he wanted to be able to fit 20 lands with still having basic plains. I have seen another version, DakFaden07 played a version that had 20 lands, still had Overgrown Tomb in the main, and then had plains in the sideboard. But the player said that he did not want to have, he basically either didn't want to play plains at all in the 75, or he wanted to have it in the main deck. He didn't see it as worthwhile to have it in the sideboard. So those are some choices there. And again, he finished top 8 in the challenge, could have gone even further. We don't know, but with this list, and then looking at the sideboard, so he did say that he would change one thing about the sideboard choices here, and that would be, he originally ran Lavinia because he thought it would be good against like Scam. It ended up being very mediocre, he said, so he'd rather just have this be 2 sweepers to help with Rhinos, to help with random like tribal creature decks, and to help with Hammer Time. So that could be a 1-1 split of something like Engineer Explosives and Filigree Silex, just because we like the split, because Pithing Needle is very common in Hammer Time, especially nowadays. So you don't want to play 2 Engineer Explosives in your deck, and then your opponent plays Pithing Needle, and then you're in trouble. And another thing that's nice about Filigree Silex, which is basically Ratchet Bomb, but with like some slight upside, is that you can play it on 0 and then try to decide if you want to take it up to 1, which I've actually found in the Hammer Time matchup that can be better in some ways than Engineer Explosives, because sometimes you play Engineer Explosives on 1 and your opponent now has a bunch of Saga tokens or, plays around it. Or the reverse is like you play Engineer Explosives on 0 and then your opponent just, plays around it because they get a bunch of 1-drop. So Silex or Ratchet Bomb gives you the option to try to tailor it. And of course, against like Rhinos, it's going to be the same, basically. That like you're going to pay 2 mana to wipe the board of Rhinos. So that's really what you want to look for. And then the other sideboard choices, which we're not used to seeing as much, Alpine Moon, I think that was mostly for helping is like Urza Saga, Jund kind of matchup. Basically any deck playing Urza Saga, and maybe a little against Tron, although I think against Tron's kind of a favorable matchup. And then, of course, when you're playing Tarmogoyf, you can't play Graveyard Hate that's, exiles your own graveyard. Like, it's kind of a nombo because you don't want to make or exiles all graveyards. You don't want to make your Tarmogoyf a 0/1. So you're going to play other Graveyard Hate. In this case, 2 Nihil Spell Bombs and then 1 Unlicensed Hearse, which was hidden here at the bottom. So this is the 75 you went with. And again, I think it's a great choice if you want to try out Preordain. I'm kind of unclear on the testing of whether 4 Tarmogoyf is best versus a mix of Neshoba Brawler and Tarmogoyf versus a mix of Tarmogoyf and Orcish Bowmasters. All those are viable options. But I think this is a great way to go, and it worked out again with the top 8 finish in the Modern Challenge. Moving on to deck number 2, we've got a deck that finished 12th in a Modern Challenge. This is piloted by Kahlua777 on MTGO. And this is a deck that's not playing Preordained, but it is playing a full playset of Orcish Bowmasters as well as 3 Neshoba Brawlers. So this is another approach I've seen taken. I've done some testing with this. I thought it was pretty strong, depending on the meta you're in. But you're getting to play Orcish Bowmasters, and this is a very strong card against decks like Scam and against decks like Murktide. So basically, decks that are playing Orcish Bowmasters, so that could be that could be Scam, it could be Jund. There's other, mono black decks floating around with Bowmaster. Like, having your own Bowmaster is a great answer to that. As well as decks that are trying to draw a lot of cards. So again, things like Prowess, Bowmaster is going to be good against. Things like Murktide, especially, which is one of the most common decks, making a comeback, especially with Preordain. So it's where it's nice to play the full playset of Bowmaster. And then you've also still have 3 Neshoba Brawler. So you should still be able to have pretty consistent Stubby D Ferocious activation because you've got still 11 cards that turn it on. So I think that's a great approach. And then looking at the sideboard here, we've seen a lot of typical choices. He went up to 3 Rest in Peace. Maybe that's just because he was expecting, you really wanted that Graveyard Hate. He's got 3 Reprieves as well, which is very good against Tron, big mana kind of decks. And then we've seen the typical choices. We've got some Cascade Hate, you've got Terra Sunder, you've got 2 Teferi against some more Cascade Hate, and then you've got a sweet board with Tetsugu. Some interesting choices here. I think you can't really go wrong with playing Bowmaster, especially in a meta where you think you're expecting a lot of those matchups. Again, interesting choices. I think if you want to try out Bowmasters, it's great to try it out as like a 4 of. It makes it easier to kind of evaluate. This is, again, a different kind of approach you're seeing. So you're seeing that same core of cards we saw in the other Domain Zoo shell, and what we've seen a lot of shells, but it's kind of playing around with these last, say, 7 to 8 slots. Some players, like the last deck was playing 4 Tarmogoyf and 3 Preordain in those last kind of 7 spots. So there's definitely a lot of different ways to approach it. It's kind of unclear at this point what is the best, build, and it ultimately might be meta dependent too on what you're kind of expecting in your own meta. Okay, lastly, I've saved the spiciest deck for the end here, and this is a deck that finished, I think, top 16 in a challenge piloted by DwightkSchrute, and this is a deck that is playing Gaia's Might and Might of Alara. So for those of you who don't know, I do get a lot of questions about these cards, playing them in Domain Zoos. They're a pump spell that if you have Domain, you're going to give a creature a +1 or +5/+5. So you can think of them kind of as a 1-mana Tribal Flames, except for you have to have a creature that's connecting with damage. So these are both the same card. They are kind of reprints, so you can actually play 8 copies of this exact same effect. I get a lot of questions about this. I think it is definitely a strong effect. The problem with anything like this is it is a combat trick, so that means that you are very weak to removal with this. Like, the worst thing you can imagine is, like, you would connect with this big creature, you pay 1 mana, and then your opponent just, exiles a creature, whether that's with Leyline Binding, Bolts, Solitude, things like that. And Modern is a format where there's generally a lot of removal. And decks that don't play removal are kind of combo decks that are trying to do their own thing pretty fast. And I find that Domain Zoo generally actually has a pretty favorable matchup against combo decks because we are aggressive in combination with playing Blue Permission, can really disrupt a lot of combo game plans. This deck also has some very interesting choices. So you've got 3 Triomes, Rafine's, Savai Triome, and Datha Triome. So again, a kind of a much different mana base. You have Stomping Ground, things like that. Not a mana base I've typically seen. Most mana bases for 21, 22 lands with Domain Zoo are going to be about the same. This one has a lot of interesting choices. The 3rd Triome is it's actually got 4 Triomes. Normally, I wouldn't play more than 2. This player did get good results playing it, so so he did decide to go with 4 Triomes, which to me is kind of crazy, but I guess you can cycle extra ones. He really wanted to get his Domain, I guess, early to turn on Gaia's Might. So the other interesting thing about this list is he is playing 4 Bowmaster, which we saw in the other deck, but what's unusual about this, I would say, is normally for a card like Might and one of the Mights is you want something that has some evasion or trample. So like Neshoba Brawler could be good because that way, even if it's blocked by something, you can pump it and still push the damage through. I guess you do get around that a little bit. Obviously, you have Cyno Draco, can give trample to Kavu, but you also have Orcish Bowmaster giving you the token. So there is the possibility that you can go around kind of the opponent's blockers a little bit, attack with, a bunch of different creatures, don't have enough blockers, and then whatever they don't block, you can grow with your Might of Alara or your Guy's Might, and then deal a bunch of damage that way. Looking at the sideboard, we see some common choices and then some interesting choices. We do have Gigantha still, but the player's going with 4 Force of Vigor. Again, he does have the extra green cards with the Mites. He's up to, let's count, 11 green cards, which is could support Force of Vigor if you count it. You're talking about 14 cards for supporting 3, so it's potentially doable. Again, there's argument that maybe the matchups you want Force of Vigor in, you don't need Gigantha in. Talking about like Amulet Titan, Hammer Time, kind of like faster decks like that. So I think that's a fair argument. I just haven't normally liked playing Force of Vigor because you tend to be pitching away green cards that you want. They're your 2-mana threats, and that's really like your 1-mana creatures. Like, your creatures are how you win with this deck, and without extra card draw, you don't have a way to kind of regain that advantage sometimes. So it can depend on your hand, but in general, you might like pitch Territorial Kavu, but that's like kind of the threat you want to play on turn 2. So I haven't loved Force of Vigor, but I think it can work in some lists or in particular metas. Definitely helps you a lot on the draw, which is when you need it most against these kind of faster, explosive decks that are using artifacts like Hammer Time and Amulet Titan. Also, Unmoored Ego, this is an interesting choice. Not something you usually see in a deck that's this aggressive, because a lot of times I'll see Unmoored Ego in a deck that's slower because there are certain matchups, like maybe Cascade, Creativity, things like that, where combo decks where you really want to just get rid of that combo card, and your slower decks, you can't outrace them. Normally, a deck that's playing these Mites and stuff, I would think that you're fast enough to race against those decks, so you don't need something like Unmoored Ego. But again, this is what the player chose here. I just try to give some of my reasoning for why I normally don't play these cards, but it's always nice to see people trying new stuff. Does that Bone Crusher Giant? Of course, it's good against One Ring. So maybe this player, just because he was relying more on the Mites here, was worried about One Ring. Again, I haven't found One Ring to be that problematic of a card because we do have Leyline Binding and WD in the main deck. So there's a lot of disruption already built in with the One Ring. And by the time that, since we're a deck that pressures life total, a lot of times, by the time they play the One Ring on turn 4, they're kind of risking it with their activations because they just don't have a lot of life to give. So they're going to lose some life. And basically, it comes down to what I found is like they either find another ring or they're just going to lose from that. So even if they do find another ring, again, we still have pressure on board. So we can, and we have other answers. You can Leyline Binding in response to the ring tap so that they don't get to draw any cards. Or you can stub future rings, things like that. So, and of course you do have Bowmaster too, which is also very good against One Ring. But this is what this player was going with. Definitely an interesting take. And I would say if you're interested in playing some of the Mites here, then this could be a build to try out and see how you like it. But let me know in the comments below what build you like. If you like these type of videos where I just kind of feature decks that have done well. I do get a lot of questions of like how to play certain cards and things like that. So hopefully I showed you some lists that are in the kind of following this Domain Zoo shell, but are playing different things in those slots if some of those cards interest you. And if you like this video, you can go ahead and subscribe. I put out gameplay videos and videos like this every week. Thanks for watching.